Hi everybody, welcome. For this section we're going to be talking about urban geography, and so I thought what a better place to talk about urban geography and do this thing than in an urban setting. So I am actually walking down the street here a little bit, and I'm going to be finding a good place to sit, but we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the geography of urban areas. And there are basically four key points here that I want to emphasize. The first one being that urban problems are really new problems, and we'll get into this. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between basic versus non-basic industries in terms of how the economies of cities actually work, and also why cities are where they are, something called central place theory, which is in the reading too. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is how urban areas affect the environment. All right, so we take a look at the urban area around me. As you can see, very built up. I am in Okinawa, a island that is south of the main part of Japan, but is politically controlled by Japan. And so, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to sit down instead of continuing to walk down the street. All right, so to start with, point number one is that humans have never really lived next to each other in close proximity the way they do in today's cities. And so because of this, urban problems of today are really somewhat new. So for instance, there's never been this many people on the planet. They've never lived in the kinds of concentrations or densities that we see today. And so therefore, all the problems we see in urban areas in terms of overcrowding, in terms of how to get the resources into them, in terms of how to get the waste products out of them, these are all new problems for humanity. If we look at the trend of urbanization through time, is that it says that, today just over half of human beings live in cities, and that by the year 2050, the estimate is about 70% of the world's population will live in cities. This is very different than the way humans have lived for most of their existence. If you look back at 1800, about 3% of the world's population lived in cities, and in 1900, about 13 cities existed with populations of 1 million or more. Now, more than 50% of the world's population live in cities. And in 2010, there were about 450 cities that had 1 million people or more, compared to the fact that there was only 13 of these just a little over 100 years ago. So this is really a fairly new phenomenon that people live in these kinds of agglomerations. And one of the things that makes this possible is, of course, industrialization. It enables urbanization, it allows us to move resources from different areas. I think in the population section I talked a little bit about the idea of carrying capacity and how that doesn't really apply to cities in a sense, because Manhattan Island couldn't possibly support the millions of people that live there, but it can only if you have kind of industrialization and the ability to move large amounts of products there. The other thing is that urbanization in developing countries is only partly due to urbanization and industrialization. We'll talk a little bit about this, and the chapter gets into this idea of like the slums, which now close to 1 billion people live in what are considered slums or shanty towns on the edge of major cities around the developing world, where people are seeking, leave rural areas, seeking a better life, but the economic systems in those cities are really unable to support that kind of growth. If we look at the cities in terms of how urban the populations are, you can see that places like the United States are heavily urban, same with places in Latin America. Interestingly, places like Australia, they have a lot of land, but where the people live tends to be in all the cities right along the coasts. The places that have higher amounts of rural population are places like Central Africa, Southeast Asia, India, up through this direction. Okay. Key point number two is about basic versus non-basic industries in city economies. So, let me back up. A basic industry is something that actually brings money into a city. And so this is some kind of product where people are paying money from somewhere else into the city. So let's think of like a place where maybe they have a place that manufactures computer chips. Let's say there was a big business in Keene that made computer chips, and people were buying them all over the place in China and Japan and other parts of the United States. That would be a basic industry, because we'd be making something, the money would be coming into the community from somewhere else. Now, there are examples of basic industries in Keene. The college itself is actually a basic industry. People come there and spend money, whether they were from Connecticut or Massachusetts or other parts of New Hampshire. They come and spend money on campus which employs people like myself or people that are staff and people that are administration on campus. And so that is a basic industry for the town. If the college closed down in Keene, you wouldn't have all of these, you wouldn't have that money coming into the community to begin with. So that's a basic industry. A non-basic industry are the things that sort of feed on that money that comes in from the basic. So in the case of Keene, things like the pizza place, or maybe the co-op, the Monadnock co-op, or other small stores, would be non-basic industries. In other words, they're not the money that comes into the community from the basic industries like the college. The people that work there now take their money and then go spend it in the community at the non-basic industries. So places like the pizza places, they're not necessarily getting all their money from people coming from out of town and getting money. They're making their money from the people that are already in town that have made their money some other way. So in terms of activities to support an urban population, the basic sector brings money in from outside the community. The non-basic sector supplies residents with goods and services. So the total economic structure of an urban area equals the sum of these different basic and non-basic activities. But the key is that if you don't have a basic industry, you can't really have these non-basics. So in other words, let's say you're a town that has a big plant that makes cars, and the automobile factory closes down. Well, all the people that used to service those auto workers, the hairdressers, the bankers, the realtors, the all the services that would surround that, all those jobs all disappear too. Also, when a place adds basic jobs, basic sector jobs, it adds all sorts of non-basic sectors. So let's say the college went on a spree and we got another 1,000 students and we hired another 50 staff and faculty. Well, now there's 50 more people that have money in Keene that are now spending it on pizza and pet supplies and bars and whatever. And so then you can have more non-basic industries. And so there's an effect from that kind of spending, and it's called the multiplier effect. Basically, this is as a city adds a basic sector job, it acquires people filling non-basic sector positions. So in other words, a typical ratio in large cities is 1 to 2. What that means is 10 new basic workers, right? Let's say the college hired 10 new people, will stimulate the creation of 20 new non-basic positions. People working in the grocery stores, in the automobile, repair shops, all these things that would service those new jobs. So we can think of how this works with population growth. If each of these new workers, let's say we add 10 basic and 20 non-basic, that's 30 people. If each of these workers represents a family of 3, the increase in population for 10 new basic jobs is 90 people. So you can see how this kind of multiplies out and has this big effect. Okay, point number 3, why cities are kind of where they are. And in some of the previous sections we talked about the idea of like industrial location and Weber, and the idea that you position your factories close to where your raw materials are to kind of and your markets so that your costs are low. Well, that's one way of that's for like placing an industry. But when we look at a city, there's another guy named Kristaller who had this idea of why cities are placed where they are. And so, when we look at why urban areas are where they are, I'll get to Kristaller here in a second, but early cities tended to be located in places that were defendable, on islands, hilltops, sheltered harbors, river bends, along trade routes. Think of the major cities in the U.S. Why is Manhattan kind of the place that it is? Well, because initially that was the first settlement. It was defendable. You could be at the very end of Manhattan Island. Wall Street actually used to be a wall that walled off the end of Manhattan from the other parts of the island to kind of defend it. And so, this is pretty typical. Places like St. Louis, where the Mississippi and the Missouri River come together, these kinds of things. And as we talked about, industrial era cities sought locations near the sources of raw materials. So like mining towns, or the example of Pittsburgh is a great example where it's located where it is because for the steel industry, it was well situated between where the coal was, where the iron ore could be brought to, and all of that, and so it kind of was this really good spot for making steel. And then, of course, locations along trade routes is very important. So this is a picture, like this island, right, the city off the coast of France, Saint-Michel. Mont Saint Michel, which was, when the tide comes in, you actually can't get to it, right? So it's very defendable. And the example of Pittsburgh, like I just talked about, is where two rivers come together, and it's also near where you could get coal and iron ore kind of delivered efficiently. All right, but there's another way of thinking about why urban areas are where they are, and this comes to central place theory, which is this guy Christaller came up with this. It's a set of models that attempts to understand why cities are located based on them as markets or as sites of consumption. So Christaller understood cities primarily as economic centers concerned with distributing goods to people and how far people would travel to go certain distances. So these travel distances dictated the placement of different sizes or orders of urban settlements. And so this is this model, and let's see, I've got a more clear one here, where the city, the really big city here in purple, then you have these kind of towns, and then black as villages, right, even smaller towns. And the idea is basically this. It comes from the top idea of threshold and range. Threshold is the size of a population required to make the provision of goods and services feasible. I'll give an example here in a second. Range is the average maximum distance people will travel for that good or that service. So think about it in New England. If you want to fly internationally, well, let's say like I just left Keene and flew to Okinawa. I didn't fly out of Keene. Why? Because nobody does. Now the question is, why didn't I fly out of Okinawa or out of Keene? Well, there's not a big enough threshold in Keene and the surrounding area to make a international airport economically viable. So in other words, that kind of a function is only going to be in the really big cities, Boston, Hartford, or in my case, I actually flew out of Montreal. And so, let's say I live in one of these towns, Keene, right? Well, it's not big enough, it doesn't meet that threshold to have an international airport, so I got to travel to the bigger cities. So the bigger cities are going to kind of arrange themselves in a way that, because I'm willing to drive 2 hours or so to go to an airport, to fly internationally. And so I'll drive to Boston, I'll drive to Hartford, I'll drive to Manchester, or in the case of Montreal, a little further than 2 hours. Or like, for instance, let's say professional sports teams. Well, why does Keene not have an NBA team, or Brattleboro not have an NBA team? There's not enough people to support that activity. But Boston can, and I'm willing to travel 2 hours to maybe go in and see a game every so often. Okay. Now there are other activities, however, that have a different threshold. So let's say grocery stores. All right, Keene, we can support a number of grocery stores. So we are at that threshold where there's enough people to support that activity. Now here's the thing, I probably wouldn't drive 2 hours to go to the grocery store. So when we talk about the range that I'll go, right, that's much smaller. But like if you live out in Swansea, or you live maybe in Brattleboro and you want to go over to New Hampshire for like not having to pay state tax, you might drive 20 minutes or so to go to one of these larger towns for that activity. And so you'll get grocery stores or small colleges, that kind of thing here. And then maybe in the small towns, there's certain things like, well, you don't want to drive 30 minutes to go get gas or go to a convenience store. So these smaller villages might be able to support a convenience store, right? And so that's how you get this kind of urban hierarchy where you have different kind of levels of function based on how many people can support that activity and how far people are willing to go for it. And that's this idea of threshold and range. And what Christaller argues is that on a flat kind of landscape, you'll end up getting cities arranged in this kind of hexagon type pattern of really big cities surrounded by kind of medium-sized cities with these villages kind of surrounding in a fairly even pattern. And this holds to some degree in places that are fairly flat, like Eastern Europe or the plains of the Midwest United States, that kind of thing. Okay, so the last key point here is that urban environments affect the environment. Okay, and the book gets into a couple different things here. I'm going to focus on just a couple. Obviously, we know about the things like the problems with solid waste and trash, or the ways in which contamination can happen, or noise pollution, or all the things that you can kind of hear in the background as I'm giving this discussion. But one of the big things is what's called an urban heat island. Urban areas, because of all the concrete and stuff, actually hold in the heat, so that they actually are much warmer in cities than the surrounding areas. So let me give you an example. So this shows here we're out in the rural countryside, the temperature may be 75. You get into the suburban areas, and because there's some concrete in commercial areas, the temperature is higher. In the urban centers, you have this bigger area here of much higher temperatures because of all the heat being kind of trapped in the cities. And so it means that the city areas can be as much as, I mean, this is, I think, slightly exaggerated, but 10, 15 degrees hotter around urban centers is not unusual at all. So you actually have a changing of the local climate based on urbanization. One of the other key ways that the environment is impacted by urban areas is that residential areas, well, is hydrology, and there's a number of ways that this happens. So that's, looking at water. First of all, urban areas use a lot of water, right, for the things that we do here, like just drinking water and other kinds of industrial processes. But residential areas are usually the greatest consumers of water in the urban areas, people watering their lawns, that kind of thing. And residential demand is greater in drier climates, as you would figure. A place like Las Vegas, Phoenix is going to use a ton of water compared to a place like New England. But the other major thing that happens is with hydrology is urbanization increases the frequency and the magnitude of flooding. And basically what happens is this, is that let's say there's an area and it's not urbanized at all, it's just regular landscape and dirt and plants. When it rains, that water hits the ground and it soaks down into the ground, maybe into the groundwater, or maybe runs off slowly into a stream through the vegetation and all of the kinds of dirt and all of that. When you urbanize an area, you start paving everything over and putting roofs on houses, and that means that there's all that area that rain is falling, and now it's not seeping into the ground. Instead, it's running off, and it's running off very fast. So all the parking lots, roofs, etc. Now when it rains, it could rain the same amount. Let's say it rains an inch, and before it was into dirt and plants, it kind of seeps down into the water, or seeps down into the soil, or then slowly works its way to the streams. Now it hits the roofs, it hits the concrete, and boom, it's all just running off very fast into the streams or rivers, which means you have a higher chance of flooding, and it's going to flood more often. So if you live downstream from a place that's urbanizing, you can start getting floods when you didn't used to, just because all the surface area is being taken up now by urban areas. So that's another important thing. Because there are certain cities, like for instance Los Angeles, I think something close to 70% of the Los Angeles basin is impermeable material. In other words, stuff that will not allow rain to penetrate now because of parking lots and freeways and roofs and all of that. And so you've totally changed the way hydrology works. Not only do you increase flooding, you also don't recharge your groundwater as quickly anymore because so much of that water is now running off. All right, other impacts. Urbanization, of course, has all sorts of other impacts in terms of this, what they call the urban footprint. And so things like the way in which people act in urban areas changes the landscape all around them. Of course, an example, let me switch here to things like natural disasters, in terms of things that can make people more vulnerable. If you think of an example like New Orleans, where it's a city that's many parts of it are below sea level, but it's in an area where there are hurricanes, and so when you get something like Hurricane Katrina, you have this big risk of having a lot of people now in these very vulnerable spaces that could potentially be damaged. Here in Okinawa, where I'm at, you now have over 1 million people on a very small island that is susceptible to typhoons, earthquakes, and tsunamis, right? And so now you have this large group of people in a small space that are more susceptible to those kinds of disasters. Okay, so that's the end of the key points for today. I think that to make sure that it's very imperative that to look over the other slides in this PowerPoint, take a look at the slides on site and situation, look at the history of urbanization. It's really important for the exam and stuff, looking at the two urban revolutions, the first one being kind of when urbanization started back, way back in the day, back about several thousand years ago, when you first started getting agriculture, and then the ability for people to live in cities because they have all this different agriculture, which can then support a larger population in a concentrated area. That's like the first urban revolution. The second being associated with the Industrial Revolution, when people started to be able to move things over large distances and really kind of conglomerate, particularly starting in Europe and North America in like the 17 and 1800s. Other things to make sure you look at gentrification, where richer people start moving into areas. But anyway, that's it for today. So I was kind of hoping that I'd get a chance to show you around Okinawa City a little bit more. This is actually Naha, which is in the southern part of Okinawa, this built-up city area. But that's it for today, and I will see you at the next Module. All right, thank you.